Hi and welcome to this ecology video where I will look at the impact of change on the distribution of organisms, and this is for biology triple students only. So an abiotic factor that could influence the distribution of organisms could be water. There are certain plants that are adapted to living in a particular habitat mainly due to how they can tolerate either being exposed to lots of water or being exposed to very little of it, as in the case of a cactus plant. On a rocky shore, you will find different zones where you would find different species of seaweed. Within each zone, the seaweed species found there are specially adapted to levels of exposure to the sun and the ratio of that to exposure to water. So, for example, at the top of a rocky shore, you will find a group or a zone of seaweed species that can cope with exposure to sunlight and UV, and they do not dry out. So this group of seaweeds have special adaptations to enable them to not get so damaged by almost constant exposure to UV radiation, and they have very thick waxy cuticles that prevent them from desiccating, from drying out. Here there is a zone of seaweed species that spend about 50% of their time submerged in water and 50% of their time exposed. These species here obviously photosynthesize, they need sunlight for this, and to make sure that they're as close to the sunlight as possible, they have all these little bladders that contain air that enable them to stay afloat, and they also have strong holdfasts because they're being battered by the waves as the tide comes in and out, but you would find that their waxy cuticle is not as thick as a seaweed plants in this zone. And then you have the lower zone seaweed plants like the kelps, and these are pretty much probably 98% of the time submerged, and they tend to have longer fronds, which are effectively the leaves that you find in the seaweed. So this is a natural way that water can influence the distribution of species. And if we take a river here that will naturally have species living within it, majority of species that you want to find in fresh water are adapted to living in clean, oxygenated environments. So if you were to sample the organisms living in the water up here, you would find mayfly and stonefly nymphs. And these are indicators of clean water. And scientists who are trying to study the pollution levels of any water system would look for indicator species like the mayfly and stonefly nymphs as a sign that the water is recovering back to a decent standard. So as the water in this river flows in this direction and goes past a factory, that factory may be seeping waste pollutants into the water, changing the conditions of the water, making it poorer quality water that carries less oxygen so can support less life. And if you were then to take a sample of the water here and you found things like red midge larva, this looks a bit like a red worm, and the reason why it's red is because it has lots and lots of hemoglobin in it. And this is an adaptation to enable this species to actually exist in very, very poor deoxygenated water. By having lots of hemoglobin, it means it can carry a lot more oxygen than you would expect a species to be able to carry in this environment. Another species that you could find here is the rat-tailed maggot. So this is a maggot with a really, really long, what looks like a rat's tail, I suppose, which simply is an air tube that can be stretched all the way up to the surface to enable this species here to get enough oxygen from the air above rather than the dissolved oxygen in the water, as there doesn't seem to be a lot of it. So scientists might monitor pollution levels in water, and if they start to find these species or similar species to the red midge larva or the rat-tailed maggot, it's a sign that there is pollution entering that water system from somewhere. If that is tackled and dealt with, further studies or further ongoing studies will be undertaken until they start to find samples that contain the indicator species that they are looking for to show or indicate that the water system is recovering from pollution and becoming cleaner and more oxygenated. Another abiotic factor that influences the distribution of organisms is what is in the atmosphere. Now, what we're looking at here is a tree trunk that is covered in these moss-like creatures called lichen. A lichen is a microscopic organism that forms colonies that then become visible, as you can see here. And you would only find these in areas of very low pollution because they are sensitive to sulfur dioxide. And sulfur dioxide is an air pollutant, and it's released whenever we burn fossil fuels, and that includes petrol in cars. So in towns and cities near roads, it's unlikely that you would find tree trunks covered in lichen. As you move further and further into the countryside where pollution levels or air pollution levels drop, you will start to see more and more lichen. So once again, lichens are also indicator species. And if more and more of these are found in certain areas that were suffering from high levels of air pollution, it's a sign that the air is recovering and getting back to a safer, less polluted standard. Another abiotic factor that influences the distribution of organisms is temperature, and we see this all the time through migration patterns of animals, especially as our British birds fly south for the winter, because by flying south they are flying towards warmer climates where their food would not be scarce, which it would be if they stayed in Britain during the winter. But it's not only birds that migrate in this way. The monarch butterfly is well known to migrate, as are different species of fish. Some species migrate to different breeding grounds, as the climate there ensures better breeding productivity. So that's a natural way that temperature can influence migration patterns. We have this issue to deal with called global warming, which I have talked about in another video, and it's mainly linked to the greenhouse effect and the human activities increasing the proportions of the greenhouse gases in our atmosphere. And that could be through combusting fossil fuels, or it could be due to deforestation or farming practices. Either way, we are building up greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, it's trapping more heat energy, and generally speaking, we are seeing climate change on a global scale. And one of the things we are certainly seeing it affecting is migration patterns of birds. So some birds are no longer flying south for the winter, and as a result, those southern areas that are expecting those birds, with particular regards to the plant species that are expecting their pollinators to arrive, are not getting that expectation fulfilled. So that's now having a knock-on effect on pollination and food webs in general. Another migration pattern that is changing is that of the mosquito, and even though we do have mosquitoes in the UK in the summer, they do not carry malaria. The mosquito that does carry the malaria parasite currently tends to be distributed in equatorial or hotter regions of the world, but that is changing as other regions are warming up. So that means it will not be long before we have malaria in Europe and potentially in the UK. So that sums up this short video on the impact of change on the distribution of organisms. Scientists who study this change are looking for indicator species to see if the negative impacts of those changes of any pollution are starting to be overcome and polluted areas are starting to recover. Do check in again soon, and thank you very much for watching.